our conversation is on very practical issues, because Bénédicte was a veteran banker. I mean, all this around the practical issues that she's on top of it, and she's a University of Chicago alumni, and I was very happy to see that she was appointed by the BIS Innovation Hub. She will, I believe that she will spend about 30 to 35 minutes, just talk about the BIS view on CBDC, and we will start. I will leave more time for discussion for everybody. Okay. Here's Bénédicte. The floor is yours.
Good, thank you. So, hello everyone. So I'll be talking today about payment innovation in a world of change, and particularly payment innovation from the point of view of the BIS Innovation Hub. So as mentioned on the front page on the disclaimer, some of the views that are expressed herein are based on research, and others are my own views. So maybe to introduce to everybody who we are. So we are the BIS Innovation Hub. We are actually a totally new operation of the BIS. We have hub in Switzerland, in Hong Kong, and in Singapore. So you see our three center heads here, myself, Morten, and Andrew. And the head of the BIS Innovation Hub is Benoit Carré, who's a former member of the ECB board. And Ross Leckhoff is our special advisor. So question is, why were we suddenly actually set up? And the reason is because the speed of change is, as you can see, is accelerating very fast. And what I showed here is the capsule of SpaceX, as you can see, and what it really is speed of innovation than it's been ever before. And in fact, that is the best example. But what we're experiencing now is that the speed of innovation is also coming to the world of finance. So in the world of finance, we thought that as central banks, what we best can do is to work together to try and see how we can crack difficult nuts, to be honest, that are being thrown at us. So within the BIS-IH, we're focused on these 6 strategic areas that you can see here. So SupTech and RegTech, next generation FMIs, central bank digital currency, open finance, green finance, and also cybersecurity. Now, for the purpose of today, I think we're spending more time on central bank digital currency because apparently that is mostly what is the interest of the CBER. So the question is, where did it all start? As introduced, I actually did spend a lot of time in banking. And I then moved to the regulator, securities regulator, and I was also a representative on IOSCO on the topic of actually fintech. And so I noticed this phenomenon called Bitcoin. And in fact, where we are today is very much influenced by the birth, you could say, of Bitcoin and the Bitcoin white paper, which is now 12 years ago. So I think you will all know that the Bitcoin white paper was born from a very anarchistic context, actually. So one could say it's born from the absolute opposite of central banking. And in fact, it is born from a context where it doesn't think there should be anything really centralized, and the world should be fully decentralized. An algorithm for enabling payment, and we can be positive or negative about that algorithm, but I would say that the positive aspect is that 12 years on, there hasn't actually been any errors in the algorithm, and it's still running. Now, what Bitcoin though did, it spurred an enormous amount of unregulated innovation. As you all know, the first big ecosystem after Bitcoin is the Ethereum-linked ecosystem, which introduced then the concept of smart contracts, and which in turn led to a lot of innovation in the form of ICOs. Now, as you all know, there is also an enormous amount of fraud that has happened in this space. And consequently, the securities regulators got quite focused on this area somewhere around 2017. So I was still at the securities regulator. I then actually left the securities regulator and I joined, in fact, this sector to try and understand what really was going on. And we're going to see that play out on the next few slides. So at the time, I said, you saw all these different cryptocurrencies pop up. And in fact, I on purpose showed here a coin representation of them because they should be crypto and they shouldn't be represented in the form of actual coins. But the funny bit of this sector is that it is sitting somewhere in between trying to mimic the old world in this form, but being the total new world. So what you see here is, in fact, a quote unquote from Agustin Carstens, who's the general manager of the BIS, and who at the time in 2018 said that these cryptocurrencies are neither good as a means of payment, they're not a unit of account, they're not suitable as a store of value, and consequently they dramatically fail on each of those counts and do not constitute currency. However, what was happening in the background is really this, is that Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies morphed into stable coins. And some of these stable coins are actually approved by regulators and backed by fiat held in regulated financial institutions. They thereby did an attempt to resolve the prior weaknesses, which are the lack of store of value, the lack of unit of account, and the lack of means of payment, and thereby opening an enormous amount of difficult policy questions of privately issued tokens and currency. So as you can see on this picture, the biggest of these supposed stable coins is Tether. Now, Tether, as you know, has been questioned on multiple occasions by specifically the US regulators, and there is ongoing questions as to whether it is fully backed by reserves or not. So Tether, as of this day, remains a fully unregulated stablecoin, but you can also notice it's actually the biggest of them, and this chart is not showing where it is today, is actually even much higher than what you see there. But meanwhile, as you can see from the colors, a number of other stable coins are born. And in fact, these stable coins have different properties. But as said, some of these are backed by fiat held in regulated financial institutions. So some of these stable coins essentially are smart contracts that so-called mint a coin upon the receipt of US dollars in a bank account held with the regulated financial institution, and that inversely burn the tokens when the money is redeemed in fiat. So these type of stable coins, as said, do resolve some of the prior issues around instability that Bitcoin had shown. Off the back of this innovation, clearly Facebook took note, and Facebook issued its Libra white paper #1. And I did update my slide. As of 3 days ago, they renamed Libra to Diem. So this is the new name we now all need to get used to. So essentially, it started with white paper 1, which was proposing to create a whole new type of currency that would be based on a basket of underlying fiat. That in and of itself obviously generated a series of securities regulatory questions, because when you make a basket, you come very close to the definition of a collective investment scheme, or potentially in this case a money market fund. The concerns of a run on a money market fund of a very significant size, as this potentially would have been, were material. And these are very, very black and white questions, understanding securities law. But aside from the questions understanding securities law, the creation of a new basket by a private entity also obviously created questions around financial stability and control of the weighting of the assets in that basket. So consequently, as you see here, we've issued very recently in the last few weeks in the BIS is different trends and puts them within context. And it points out specifically that the announcement of Libra has taken a private stablecoin onto an entirely different plane than any previous cryptocurrency or stable. It acknowledges that stablecoins could bring some benefits in the cross-border transfer context, but that they also raise substantial questions for monetary and financial authorities. So the birth of the BIS Innovation Hub is really linked to the lecture by Agustin that was discussing the future of central banking and what the role of the central bank is in light of this evolution. Because when technology comes around and tries to do something quicker or faster or better or lower cost, there's somehow a need that it saw, or there is a it saw and that it wants to cover. So that generates significant questions for central banking as to whether there is a need for central banks to change some of the infrastructure that we had in the past. So as mentioned, we have 6 themes that we cover in the BISIH, and just to repeat them: Subtech and RegTech, next-gen financial market infrastructures, CBDC, open finance, green finance, and cybersecurity. But right now, for this purpose, because we're talking about digital currency, I'm going to focus on the central bank digital currency debate. I would note that it is very closely linked, though, to the prior theme of the BISIH, which is the next generation financial market infrastructures. So in one of our hubs, we're looking at connectivity between faster payment systems. Faster payment systems are existing infrastructure, and therefore we put that under theme 2. Whereas for CBDC, we break it out as a separate theme under theme 3. So again, we have a lot of research within the BIS, and you could see, and I've sourced everything so that you can see exactly from which research, and it's very easy to make use of it in the future. So as you can see, going by Google search, there is a certain hype effect that happened around Bitcoin, not surprisingly, then around Facebook Libra, and that hype effect seems to have moved to central bank digital currency. So it seems that everybody is somehow seeing this evolution that I just described, from this highly anarchistic proposal that Bitcoin was, to the evolution of stablecoins and the adoption by Facebook of that concept. And then now the reaction of the central banks as to what this means in terms of our role within the financial system and financial infrastructure. So this map, another one from our research, shows the CBDC development across the world. And as you can note, there is a distinction between wholesale CBDC and retail CBDC. And you can also see that there is a distinction in the number of pilots versus live. In fact, there's only one live, as you can tell, which is the Bahamas, and that was actually very recently. So if you look at retail CBDC, what I personally find noteworthy is that it's concentrated on big markets. And that could potentially link to the fact that maybe the penetration or the financial inclusion is still lower in some of these bigger markets, or that there's somehow more potential for retail CBDC, the introduction of a new payment method in these bigger markets. Europe in that context should be seen as one, even though we see obviously all the different countries. But we see focus in China on this, and we see focus as well, or at least mention in the United States. Wholesale CBDC, on the other hand, is these efforts are concentrated typically in hubs that have played a hub role, including Singapore and Hong Kong, and now also, as I will explain, Switzerland. So what is the difference between a wholesale CBDC and a retail CBDC? Keep in mind, none of them exist as yet, but a retail payment system is very, very different from a wholesale payment system. So I showed in left-hand side of this slide, this distinction, is that in retail payments, each of the payments tend to be very low in value, but the volumes are very large. Whereas in wholesale, these are typically very large value payments that often need to settle on a particular day and sometimes by a particular time. And given the systemic importance, wholesale payment systems are generally owned and operated by central banks. So this is an area where central banks, through the banking system, play a very significant role. If you look at the picture that I placed here, in fact, it doesn't show a very large distinction, really, in the reason for focus. And I think that is because we're at the very early stages still of testing and defining this, and of defining the use cases. So quite recently, the head of the BIS Innovation Hub, amongst a group of leading central banks, has issued a report on the core features for general purpose CBDC. It includes what I've set out on this slide: resilient, secure, convenient, and available at very low or no cost to the end users, underpinned by appropriate standards and a clear legal framework, and an appropriate role for the legal sector, as well as promoting competition and innovation. This report, however, contains a lot more useful detail in terms of what the possible design choices are that need to be made. So for retail CBDC architectures, for those of you who are very close to the debate, you will know that it all started with the direct CBDC. And this obviously creates a lot of questions, because central banks have not been in a habit in the past to be operating retail accounts. It would be a very, very material change for a central bank to directly operate and open retail accounts. It would need to set up a KYC infrastructure to start off with. And that KYC infrastructure would need to be fully compliant with all AML and sanctions-related rules and regulations. These are not minor tasks, and these are tasks that have typically been performed by the intermediaries. Consequently, the focus has probably shifted towards hybrid CBDC, where the central bank actually continues making use of the banking system, but where nevertheless the CBDC remains a direct claim on the central bank. Below it, you can see the so-called indirect architecture, where the bank that issues, in this case, probably a stable coin, has assets, holds an equivalent amount of assets with the central bank. The distinction between the indirect architecture and the hybrid CBDC is that the indirect one is not a direct claim on the central bank. So the user, in this case A, does not have a direct claim on the central bank. Whereas in the other case, the hybrid CBDC and the direct CBDC, the user A has a direct claim on the central bank, meaning he or she owns a riskless asset. In the case of the indirect architecture, you could say there is the credit risk on the bank. So those are the, let's say, high-level architectural decisions that different central banks have to make. But as indicated also in the report that I just previously raised, it notes quite clearly that monetary policy is a national issue driven by a national context. And I think this is very important in the context of retail CBDC. We may end up in a situation where different central banks are going to make different choices depending on the use cases of that CBDC in their specific market. So you see on left-hand top side, this, which is actually not sourced to BIS research and which I actually took from the internet. The reason I took it is because I think it quite succinctly actually sets out the difference between Cash, Bitcoin, Libra in its first iteration and the DCEP. I would say that the DCEP is now called the ECNY and Libra is now called DM. So the picture is slightly outdated by a few days, but all these developments were just in the last few weeks. So the key aspects here, let's say, that I would want to focus on is the type of blockchain technology used. In the case of the DCEP, it's not making use of a decentralized system, it's making use of a centralized system. In the case of Libra, it would be a permission-based blockchain. Originally, it was scheduled to be a permissionless open and public blockchain, but that plan was abandoned. Bitcoin is a public blockchain, and Cash, as you know, is just Cash. It's not on a technology or a chain of any sort in that regard. So I said, if you look at the decentralized nature, the DCEP is not decentralized. Libra is partially decentralized. Bitcoin is fully decentralized. And again, I don't think the concept fully applies to Cash. Another aspect that different places will differently emphasize is the offline payment support. So in the case of Cash, that is an offline tool, right? You do not need your Wi-Fi. In the case of the DCEP, it is viewed to be an important feature because in the case of China, there is a lot of places where the Wi-Fi may not be as good as you would want it to be. Now, on the other hand, you have some other markets where the Wi-Fi penetration will be very high, in which case this offline payment ability may be less of an immediate priority. I also showed on this slide some other choices that can need to be made. And in particular, I would say the choice between privacy and AML compliance. I showed under this a picture of a United Nations release. And it notes that the amount of money laundering that is actually happening globally, which in 1 year is estimated per these numbers around billion to 2 trillion US dollars, which is a very significant amount. The more significant issue is that only a very small fraction of that actually gets caught and gets properly enforced against. Now, when you look at the inverse context, that the banks are spending an enormous amount of money and resources to try and find those 800 billion to 2 trillion, and yet they only find a single digit percentage gets actually enforced against, then you could think that there is definitely room for improvement. Now, technology can for sure improve that. However, it does create a difficult dilemma with the question on privacy, right? So cash in many ways is private. Digital cash can be private, or it cannot be private. So if you look again at the chart with the DCEP, there it says anonymous. It says it can be made anonymous, whereas the other three are anonymous, right? So this is a very important trade-off, and it is probably one of the most important questions that I think needs to be looked into, is whether our CBDC will mimic cash or whether it won't mimic cash. Now, when you look at the ECNY, it's not mimicking cash in that regard. But again, for some other countries, the trade-off might be that it will fully mimic the privacy of cash. The other element I put on this slide is the interest-bearing versus not. Again, a very important, I think, economic consideration to be made. It is directly linked to how you could use this type of RCBDC, but it would also consequently have potential implications in terms of banks and deposits. So that was our CBDC, and now I will move to wholesale CBDC, and I will start with the background. So wholesale payments in some countries, and I specifically here gave an example of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, we have a so-called faster payment system, and we 4 hours a day, like right now, it arrives right on the spot in the account. This is how simple it is, and it's immediate. So this is just to demonstrate that domestic wholesale payment systems have innovated already, right? So we could think that they're not in order. It kind of depends on the country or on the place, but in certain places, they're certainly functioning actually extremely effectively. So as indicated there in the text, actually quite a long time, there is a lot of innovation in this space in the RTGS systems and the faster payment systems. More recently, since the mid-2000s, trends have included opening up access to non-banks, expanding operating hours, and improving the interoperability of these systems. And as said, there has been a pattern of central banks opening up access to non-banks. This is important in the context of the debates around stablecoins, for example. So the difficulty, therefore, if one might say, is not in domestic wholesale payments, as long as the place has a proper RTGS and ideally faster payment system. So where does the problem then lie? Like, why were these cryptocurrencies, including Bitcoin, but also the stable coins, why did they see the light of day? And they really saw the light of day to address the cross-border problem. So it proves that in cross-border wholesale payments and even retail payments, in both, there are a series of problems. And we've set those out in the report of the CPMI. So again, I've sourced this slide. This is a very important slide because it adds up all the different problems that we can see that slow down or create friction in cross-border wholesale payment. Of these, you can see that item 19 is to factor an international dimension into CBDC designs. So in fact, CBDC falls under item 19, but all the others are nearly equivalently important issues. And not surprisingly, you see again, KYC, AML, counter-terrorist financing, they all keep popping up as frictions in the system, but they are, one could say, necessary frictions in the system. Are there frictions one need to address and which therefore necessarily will slow down the payments or increase their costs unless eliminated? And eliminating these AML and counter-terrorist financing exist is obviously not an option. So therefore, moving on to cross-border CBDC, it is not a very easy nut to crack. As I said, we have a lot of nuts to crack, and this is not an easy nut to crack because on the technical side, the complications are firstly around the fact that it always involves an FX conversion. And this is very important to keep in mind, because dollar stable coins that currently exist, first of all, they're only US dollar. So they're actually, to a large extent, ignoring the FX issue. In the context of wholesale payments, these would involve FX conversion. And again, FX conversion comes with many complicating factors, such as the need to have balance sheets to deal with, to create the liquidity around the FX transactions. So again, secondly, liquidity management in foreign currencies can be costly. As explained here, for cross-border and multi-currency systems, the settlement agent might not be willing or able to provide intraday liquidity to foreign participants or in foreign currency. So again, the FX issue becomes the real complicating factor. And then furthermore, on cross-border level, the technical interoperability of payment systems is difficult. And as noted at the end of that paragraph, there is a collective action problem. Again, something for economics to think through. It requires collaboration across different jurisdictions and ideally all of them, which is not easily achieved. On top of these that I set out, as the normal difficulties come in, including conflict of law and adherence to typically multiple anti-money laundering and terrorist financing regimes. Although there has been quite some effort in this regard to harmonize, nevertheless, they are not identical. Money laundering laws are after all, national. So I move a little bit to a couple of the projects that we have been working and that are ongoing. So in the case of Hong Kong, we have an ongoing project called Intanon Lion Rock. You can see here the first issued report on the topic. It is highly detailed and it describes to you exactly the architecture that is being used there to try and speed up these cross-border payments and to do them at lower cost and more efficiently. This report is of the first phase of the project. The second phase of the project has just been announced. And is involving both consensus as well as PricewaterhouseCoopers and Forums Hong Kong, working together with both the Bank of Thailand as well as the HKMA. And importantly, this project can accommodate the involvement of more regional central banks or global central banks. So it is likely to be extended into involving more central. So what the first project, so the first phase studied is how you could reduce this cross-border transfer cost, which per the World Bank is estimated at around 7%. Again, central to it is the difficulties around compliance with AML laws, which are typically in the remit of the Financial Action Task Force, and which have given birth to a correspondent banking system. The correspondent banking system, however, has several embedded costs. And as you can see on those two pictures, what the project did is to reduce the number of intermediaries through the so-called corridor network. So it does not eliminate the intermediaries, it just reduces the number of hops, so to say, before the payment arrives on the other side of in another country, in this case between Hong Kong and Thailand, but it can be applied to any other country's context. So phase 2, as said, will be focused on the fact that the model that was created is scalable and can be extended to other jurisdictions and markets. And as said, phase 2 is now launched. The findings of phase 1 are listed here on this slide. It was to improve settlement efficiency, enhance liquidity efficiency, comply better with rules and regulations through direct insight into the ledger by the central banks. And as said, this architecture can be expanded to more central banks. A separate project that is going on in the wholesale CBDC space within the Swiss Center is a project working with the Swiss National Bank and a digital asset exchange called SIX. And it focuses on settling the trading in digital assets, so digital securities, with Cbdc. In fact, just an hour ago, the report was issued, so you could all take a look at that on the internet and see what this particular test yielded and how this test will be extended. So from my perspective, as mentioned, we're working on 6 teams, not just the CBDC team. So for anybody who's listening in, we are big believers that we need to collaborate. These problems are very difficult to solve. None of it has an off-the-shelf solution. And if there was, then it would be in effect already. Therefore, as said, we are open to collaboration, including importantly with academics from across the world, and anybody who's interested in talking with us about any ideas on any of these 6 teams that I listed up front, please do contact us. So that's it from my side.
Oh, thank you, Bénédicte, for this very informative, very interesting talk. So the plan will be, I will start just asking some questions, and the participants, feel free to raise your hand or typing your questions in the chat box, so that we will have some lively discussion. I see familiar names here. If you raise your hand, I will just put you in the discussion room so that we can just chat. Okay. Let me just ask the first question. So I sense that from the talk is that the biggest thing that it seems like the regulator is trying to making sure that all system is fair and fast, efficient. But the market participants obviously will not put that into the first round. And and something pops out very, very clearly, as you mentioned, is the KYC and the ML. How does I wrap my head would think that, okay, retail maybe that you could help on that, but wholesale CBDC, which the Hong Kong government and the one that I'm familiar with, seems like they were approaching on this wholesale CBDC. And you said that wholesale CBDC is basically just cutting the chain. Is that the way that they think they can improve on the AML and the KYC? Because otherwise, it still gets to the issue where the regulator worry about all this money laundering, while the economy or the market players try to evade it and then get some rent from it.
Yeah, so very theoretically, maybe to distinguish between a retail CBDC and a wholesale CBDC. So, and also, frankly, any cryptocurrency. In fact, a cryptocurrency, if built on a blockchain, is auditable, right? Because that is the very property of the ledger, is that one can see the public address, right? The problem with the ledger is, with the current existing ones or all the cryptocurrency proposed ones, is that they do not link it to identity. So you can definitely see the movement on a chain, which is extremely useful in a way, right? Because in the do not have the benefit of that one ledger that you can follow. So you have the advantage of the ledger, but it's not linked to the identity. So to just have numerically the public key, it doesn't actually help you to know who is the perpetrator of financial crime. And consequently, the focus of FATF has been to repeatedly explain that the sector will need to plug this gap and will need to apply the so-called travel rule, which means that identity must travel along with the payment. Right? In the case of current existing banking system, the identity is traceable. In the case of these blockchain systems, the nice thing is there is a ledger, but thing is, in fact, is very hard to trace who, if there is a non-compliant payment, whose non-compliant payment it is. So that's in the case of the existing digital currencies. Now, technically, a central bank digital currency could be developed to have traceability. And it does appear that the ECNY has that traceability to it, right? So it's called pseudo-anonymous, but there is a traceability element. So again, as I mentioned, the question is a policy choice, whether one wants it to be traceable or to mimic cash, which is not traceable in most cases, right? So therefore, retail CBDC. On your question on wholesale CBDC, the correspondent, so every bank under the rules and regulations has the obligation to comply with AML, right? To comply with the normal AML ordinances within their country. It also has to perform sanctions checks. What that means in practice is that every bank performs KYC, performs ongoing AML surveillance, and performs sanctions surveillance on every single payment. So if you are in a chain of wholesale payment and you have many players in the middle, and the more players you have, the more players are repeating that process, right? So if you reduce the number of players, you actually can make that process quicker, in the sense that you reduce the number of people who repeat the same process. And you reduce the cost of needing to repeat that process. But this is on a theoretical level. The question is whether on a practical level, the improvement of that is sufficient to justify, or is a sufficient benefit, so to say, of wholesale CBDC. So part of the ongoing testing that is going on, and experimentation, you could say, is to look into this property.
Let me ask another high-level question, and then we will open to Pierre is already coming in. He has a question. So the other question I would like to know, just inviting you here,
is that what are the regulators worry about? I can list those things that you already listed, but I would like you to just really have a rank so that you know, as academia will have some sense that okay, those things that actually market in some sense that the highest conflict of interest of the regulators and the market, or some other places that you know, we can easily figure out the solution.
Yeah, maybe there I will say this is just my own view, because you're asking me off the top of my head. So first of all, it is definitely around monetary policy, right? So from a central bank point of view, it is around monetary policy, because ultimately, let's say, and that's been made clear in context of Libra, is a massive global multi-trillion system that only runs on one currency does create questions in different markets, right? So let's assume you are a small country and you have very, very high WhatsApp and Facebook penetration, and everybody starts paying in a US dollar stablecoin. What does that do to your economy? So that is a question, right? So, and let's now not focus on the US dollar, let's make it the euro, or let's make it any other currency. For smaller economies in particular, it could create questions about the sovereignty over their own currency. And ultimately, the sovereignty of a currency is something that is actually very close to the heart of every individual country. So it is a very important matter. So this is probably the most important. And as said, I made exactly the example of a one currency stablecoin, not of a basket. If you have a basket, you have many additional problems. But if it's even one currency stablecoin that is very, very large in size, it can create questions around sovereignty in own country, so to say. So that's one issue. In terms of the crypto asset space, the unregulated space, definitely it is currently to a large extent not compliant with AML rules and regulations, and FATF has set that out many times. So the point is, it's definitely quick and efficient. So what we have is we have very quick and efficient system that is nevertheless AML requirements, right? So as a central bank, or let's say as a group of central banks, for us, we would need to have something efficient but compliant, not something efficient, non-compliant. Ultimately, the role of AML rules and counter-terrorist financing is exactly what it says, right? Counter-terrorist financing. Right? It is a very important stability matter, right? It is another form of stability. It is not about monetary stability. It is about other forms of stability. So these two are very important. But as I said, the latter really contrasts, and everywhere, including in the past, but also in CBDC, it is in a little bit of a conflict with privacy.
Yeah. Okay, let me direct to...
And an ancillary issue, which you would see expressed in the speech yesterday, or the article yesterday by Mrs. Lagarde, is the question around, which is, I think, close to your area of interest, is if, let's say, payments in the trillions of dollars are executed by one technology company, let's assume, then that can generate data privacy questions for the individuals on the system.
Okay, I see. So I see that the Arita's question is, is Arita you? No. I see. Let me, oh, okay. Let me put him in later. Pierre, do you want to ask your question? Pierre?
You mean directly? Hello?
Yes, directly, please.
Hello.
Something else.
Hello to you too. Thank you very much, Bénédicte, for this wonderful talk and very, very instructive. I just wanted to ask a very quick question about what do you think the impact of the adoption of retail Cbdc would be on monetary policy? And especially, do you think that having a more direct relationship to the end users, citizens, you know, the economy, disintermediated, with CBDCs getting rid of middle banks, would increase the leverage of monetary policy? Or do you think that, as you said, the indirect systems, the indirect CBDC model would more or less reproduce the current structure that would transmit those monetary policy's actions?
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult question in a sense that I don't have the answer, so to say, right away. As said, I think maybe I just want to add it, answer it pragmatically. I think very few central banks are ready to be onboarding retail customers. So I think in that sense, it might be quite, let's say, it might be a future where we get to it, but I don't see it immediately. So therefore, then the focus is on hybrid CBDC. And again, how you can use it for financial policy or monetary policy, I think is also largely dependent on whether it's interest bearing. So if you make it interest bearing, then you can influence behaviors that way. But it's something that needs to be carefully thought through. And I said the other aspect maybe on an economics level, and I'm obviously not looking at it from a PhD standpoint, but at the end of the day, intermediaries do play roles, and one could assess whether these are useful roles, and a number of these roles could be useful roles. So I think we need to be careful to just outright take it as a goal that let's say there shouldn't be intermediaries. I personally think that would be a wrong assumption to make. I think what needs to be made as an assumption is to look at the role that the intermediaries play and think about whether these roles can be played better, and if so, how, and for each of the different features of the financial system, and how CBDC can be used to achieve that.
This is a very related to Will's question. It's also sometimes we debate on that. So Will, can you ask your question about the permissionless, permission, those things?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you very much for the talk. You know, I just want to get your opinion, Bénédicte, given your research background and experience working with regulators and central banks. Technologies are just technologies. If they are available to central banks, they are available presumably to many private parties, right? So my question is really, what do you see as the key advantage of central bank digital currency versus digital currencies based on, let's say, permissionless blockchain, or even permission blockchain by a organized by a third party, private tech firm or alliance of private tech firms? Is it a potential combination with monetary fiscal policies, or the coordination function of a centralized authority, the central bank or government? Or maybe there's a possibility for permissionless, open blockchain-based digital currencies that's not run by central banks. It's just a set of protocols, just like the internet. It's a set of protocols that people abide by. But It doesn't have to be centrally managed.
Can I add it just,
Yeah.
Arita had a similar but very practical question. This is along the same line. Was saying basically, it's a very small amount of transactions. So if it's a permissioned, like in a way that it must be that there's something, it's just inefficiency has to be outweigh the other parts of the consideration when we think about a retail and combined with the permission. So that's along similar line of Will's question.
Yeah. And if I could just qualify my question a little bit, I understand there are technological limitations, right? Centralized party might help mitigate some of the technological limitations, but suppose we can have, auditable, privacy preserving, if needed, protocols or designs. Would central bank digital currency be the only one that can take off, or you envision there is a possible outcome where private parties or permissionless blockchains might work too?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think we see these permissionless blockchains already, yeah? And as said, as I mentioned, I started by saying, where did this all start? And I didn't say it started with central banking, right? I said it started with Bitcoin, actually, and the challenge that it has created to central banking. So by implication, I think that such a system, which is Bitcoin, already exists. And I think there are many mimic systems of Bitcoin that also already exist, some of which with extreme privacy features. And then obviously in most recent months, there are continued developments around this. So I definitely think that some things will not go away. I'm one of these people who believes that things, when they evolve, they will continue to persist and to exist. The question really is about what mainstreams, right? And the reality is that a lot of people they want some sense of safety, and they feel safety in regulated systems. And for some people, they will additional safety if it is a central bank, if it is a direct claim on a central bank, right? But is that all people? I don't think so, right? And so are a number of people already bought into the religion of the fully permissionless systems? Yes, there are many, right? And are there people who sit in the middle? Yes, and those are the stablecoin people. So I think we are already now in a multi-track system, or a system with multiple systems. But I think people will need to make their own evaluation of what they want. And I think the best way to think through this is to think through your own behavior. That's how I always look at it, right? So for maybe smaller amounts, you will want to take risk, and particularly you will want to take the risk of having, for example, higher returns that unregulated systems might offer. But for the majority of your wealth, you will want to have some form of feeling of safety that, let's say, hopefully no collapse ever repeats itself like 2007. But even when it happens, that somehow you're able to get out of it without having lost all your assets, right? And so I think different people make these trade-offs very differently. And I know people who belong to each of these trains of thought. So to me, they already exist. But again, mainstream, I think people's safety. Now, in that regard, the mainstream safety will still be the regulated system. And that's not necessarily just CBDC. CBDC may be an option in that system.
Right. So the technology is really kind of enhancing the trust and reputation and reliability in that sense, rather than substituting the traditional, reputation or trust.
Well, I think that the technology improve the functionality, the speed, the reduce the cost and everything. That's exactly what it's to do and what it's doing in each of these other tracks I described. However, it will not succeed mainstreaming unless it is paired with trust. And so for a number of the cryptocurrencies, they still remain highly volatile, right? So obviously Bitcoin has gone up a lot, but let's face it, there is an element of a speculative asset here, right? Highly volatile, not backed by a central banking system, not backed by a country. So as a volatile asset, a speculative asset, it's definitely an attractive asset. As an asset for payments, we all know it's not sufficiently scalable, right? So again, then the stable coins sit somewhere in the middle because they actually are, for those that are backed by a specific currency, you're actually just having the same volatility as that currency, which is a lot less than a typical cryptocurrency. And for CBDC, what you would have as an additional aspect is the fact that it is a claim on the central bank.
Good. Christine, you have a question on the wholesale CBDC. That seems to be a slightly different topic. Christine?
Yes.
It's a very good question. Go ahead.
Oh, can you read my question or?
Yeah. Just tell us your question. Just ask directly. I don't like.
So the stylized factors, I understand it, is the number of correspondent relationships has been decreasing over time, even though the volumes on the major corridors has been increasing. The question is whether or not the introduction of wholesale CBDC is going to help or hinder this problem. Is it going to increase competition in correspondent banking, or is it going to essentially make it worse, that some of these smaller corridors are going to be underserved?
Yeah, again, it's a great question, and I don't think I have the answer. I have been asking myself the same question, because if you take a look at my last job, which was literally 6 months before I joined this job, I was at Standard Chartered, which is a correspondent bank. And the costs in the correspondent banking system are high, right? Which is exactly why you see that translate in these high costs for cross-border transfers. But like you, and as said, I don't have the answer because I haven't deepened down on the question. I have wondered that if you make the system more efficient by reducing the need for these correspondent banks, whether you get to a point where they give up these services. I think that's what you're trying to say, right? In more locations. So I don't think we know the answer for sure. But let's say so in the Internal Lion Rock report, you can see there is some reference as well to where the costs sit exactly in the correspondent banking system. And these costs have been really rising even for the correspondent banks, which is exactly why the correspondent banks have started giving up the service. So the question you're asking is whether the introduction of wholesale CBDC would speed that up. I can't answer that right away, but there are independent factors that are making that system expensive. Even banks that are in it, essentially. So maybe it could play the other way around, to argue in favor of needing to create another system. But again, I don't want to answer that on the spot.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah. So now I see that connection between my question and Christine's question. Also the moment. So our event has finished, and let me just give a little bit of the concluding talk. First of all, thanks, Bénédicte. And the idea is trying to ask Bénédicte coming here to give us a talk is because I'm not reading the most frontier of the innovations in this area, but the moment I saw Hong Kong project, Hong Kong, Thailand project, from my senses, I really think that those things are very useful, practical, and it seems like technologically easy to do. Now, it's because I'm academic, but as pointed out by Bénédicte, there's a bunch of issues to deal with, which I understand. But hopefully those things are just, with the technology that are proposed, mentioned or, advocated by Will. Will is more true believer of technology can build trust. And I'm a little bit more, skeptical on that. I think that it's just technology is a technology. Trust is something else. But maybe, we are learning along the way, including the regulators, academia, and the different parts of our regulators, I feel. And is that right? The BIS is trying to coordinate the different central banks on these issues. Is this the purpose of creating this innovation hub? Is that right, Bénédicte?
Yeah, so in fact, the BIS is a convener for the central bank. So we actually our ownership is de facto a group of central banks. And so for this BIS Innovation Hub, the whole idea is that we think that by pulling our experience together, we will probably answer faster to some of these questions. But as said, faster doesn't mean immediate. In fact, we have only existed for a few months now. Mm-hmm. So I'm only here 5 months. But obviously, having come from all these different systems that we are now seeing either questioned, whether it's the ancient system or the new system, mm-hmm. For me, I can see the evolution. But as said, the idea is that we pull together the brains of all the member central banks of the BIS.
That's great. So that concludes our today's event. And, if you have some other questions, feel free to reach out to Bénédicte. And I do think I have Bénédicte's slides. You're okay to share that, put it into the public, right? Or not at all?
Well, it depends. If it's to a closed group, it's okay. But if it's to the public, I need to probably seek separate clearance.
So if you wanted the slide, reach out to Bénédicte. And
maybe do that. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Thank you. We will meet the next event. Thanks, Will, for asking me to do this. And Bénédicte, thank you.
Yeah, feel free to contact me on LinkedIn, or my email is benedict.nolens@bisinnovationhub.org.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you. So we will just leave? I don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yes, you can just all leave and I can close it up for everybody.
Okay.
Okay. Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.